Canada's oil just got more expensive. Not because Canada cut America off, not because U.S. refiners suddenly stopped buying it, and not because Alberta crude changed overnight. It got more expensive because the discount America depended on is no longer guaranteed. For decades, U.S. refiners had one major advantage over Canadian oil producers: geography. Most of Alberta's heavy crude had to move south into the United States. That meant American refineries, especially in the Midwest and on the Gulf Coast, could buy Canadian heavy oil at a discount to West Texas Intermediate. Sometimes that discount was $20 a barrel, sometimes $25. At extreme moments, it became much wider. But that discount was not only about quality, it was about captivity. Canadian oil was valuable, but Canada did not have enough routes to global buyers. So American refiners became the dominant customers. And when one buyer side has that much power, price follows power. Now that system is changing. The Trans Mountain expansion gave Canadian crude a serious Pacific outlet. Alberta oil can now move to the coast, load onto tankers at Burnaby, and reach buyers across Asia, China, Japan, South Korea, India. That does not mean America no longer matters. It still matters enormously. The United States remains the largest buyer of Canadian crude, and U.S. refineries are still deeply tied to Canadian heavy oil. But that is exactly why this matters. Because U.S. refiners are no longer the only major price-setting force in the room. They now have to compete with the Pacific. That is the real story. Canada did not stop selling oil to America. Canada gained more pricing power. And for U.S. refiners that built their business around cheap Canadian heavy crude, that is a serious problem. Now hold on, because this is where the story can easily be misunderstood. Canadian oil did not become expensive forever in one straight line. Oil prices move, discounts widen and narrow. Global markets react to war, shipping disruption, refinery demand, inventories, and speculation. So this is not just about one price spike, it is about the structure behind the price. Before Trans Mountain's expansion, Alberta heavy crude was heavily dependent on U.S. pipeline routes and U.S. buyers. When pipeline capacity was tight, Canadian producers often had to accept a deep discount because there were not enough other large-scale buyers available. That was the old bargain. Canada produced the heavy oil. America refined it. Canada took the discount. America captured the margin. But Trans Mountain changed the bargaining table. The expanded system can move far more crude from Alberta to the Pacific coast. That means Canadian barrels can reach tidewater, load onto tankers, and enter the global market. And once oil reaches the global market, it stops being trapped. That is the difference between a commodity and a trapped commodity. A commodity has buyers. A trapped commodity has a buyer. For decades, Canadian heavy crude was too close to that second category. Now it is moving toward the first. That is why U.S. refiners have fewer cheap options. Not because they cannot buy Canadian crude anymore. They can. Not because Canadian producers want to abandon the U.S. market. They do not. But because the old discount was built on limited alternatives. And those alternatives are expanding. Think about what this means from the refinery side. Many U.S. refineries are not designed to process just any oil. A large number of them are configured to handle heavy, sour crude. That means they have invested in equipment that can process dense, sulfur-rich oil and turn it into gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, and other refined products, Canadian oil sands. Crude fits that system. That is why Canadian crude became so important to the U.S. refining complex. But it also means those refineries cannot simply wake up tomorrow and replace Canadian barrels with light oil from Texas. Yes, alternatives exist, but cheap, reliable, heavy, crude alternatives are limited. Venezuelan supply has been constrained by sanctions and production problems. Mexican heavy crude output has declined over time. Middle Eastern barrels carry geopolitical and shipping risks. Russian barrels face sanctions, price caps, and political risk. And U.S. shale is mostly lighter crude, which does not perfectly match the configuration of many heavy oil refineries. So, when Canadian heavy crude becomes more expensive, U.S. refiners feel it. They may still buy it, but they do not get the same easy bargain. That is the shift. For years, the United States had a quiet advantage. It could say, Canada has the oil, but America has the market. Now Canada can answer, America is still the biggest market, but it is no longer the only serious one. That is what Trans Mountain did. It did not just move barrels, it moved leverage. And this is why the timing matters. The expansion came online in 2024. By 2026, the system was operating at much higher volumes. Asian demand was rising. Middle East instability was reminding buyers why secure supply matters. And Canadian heavy crude suddenly looked more valuable because it came from a politically stable producer with a new path to the Pacific. Stable producer, heavy crude, Pacific access, Asian demand, U.S. refinery dependence. Those 5 pieces explain why the old pricing system is under pressure. Now let's be clear. Canada is not suddenly an oil superpower that can dictate terms to everyone. That would be an exaggeration. Canada still depends heavily on the U.S. market. Huge volumes still move south. U.S. refiners still buy massive amounts of Canadian crude. And Canada still faces political fights over pipelines, emissions, indigenous partnerships, coastal shipping, regulation, and climate policy. But the point is not that Canada escaped dependence completely. The point is that Canada reduced the trap. That is a different kind of power. Economic sovereignty is not always about walking away. Sometimes it is about having a second buyer. Sometimes it is about having a second route. Sometimes it is about making sure your biggest customer knows they are no longer your only customer. That is what makes this story part of the bigger TradEconomics series. The Gordie Howe Bridge showed us the gate. The CPKC Rail Corridor showed us the route. The oil access story showed us the hard resource. CUSMA showed us the operating system. And now Trans Mountain shows us the price mechanism. Because even when Canada has the resource, the route, and the buyer, the real question is this: who sets the price? For decades, the answer was shaped heavily by U.S. market access. Now the answer is changing. Not completely, not permanently, not without risk, but meaningfully. The Pacific has entered the price conversation. That is why American refiners have fewer cheap options. They are not being shut out. They are being forced to compete. And competition changes everything. It changes margins. It changes bargaining power. It changes investment decisions. It changes how Washington thinks about Canadian energy. And it changes how Ottawa and Alberta think about export strategy. For years, many people looked at Canadian oil and saw only barrels. But barrels are not enough. A barrel trapped inland is one price. A barrel with access to the Pacific is another price. A barrel with one dominant buyer is one kind of leverage. A barrel with multiple global bidders is another. This is why infrastructure matters. Pipelines are not just steel tubes in the ground. Ports are not just terminals. Tankers are not just ships. They are pricing power. They decide whether a country sells into a captive market or into a competitive one. And for Canada, that difference is worth billions. For U.S. refiners, it is a warning. The cheap Canadian oil discount they counted on was never guaranteed by nature. It was created by geography, infrastructure, and limited market access. Now those conditions are changing. That does not mean Canadian oil will always trade close to WTI. It will not. Markets will still move. Discounts will still widen. Refinery outages, global demand, OPEC decisions, war risk, shipping costs, and quality differences will all matter. But the old assumption has been broken. Canadian heavy crude is no longer priced only by what U.S. refiners are willing to pay. It is increasingly priced by what the world is willing to bid. Canada's oil just got more expensive because Canada's oil just became less trapped. And U.S. refiners have fewer cheap options because Canada finally has more buyers at the table. So the question now is not whether America still needs Canadian crude. It does. The real question is whether America can keep buying Canadian crude at the discount it used to enjoy when Canada had fewer ways out. That is the story. Not a cutoff. Not an embargo. Not a fantasy energy war. A pricing shift. A route shift. A leverage shift. And possibly one of the most important changes in Canada's energy economy in a generation. So, what do you think? Should Canada keep expanding Pacific export options to reduce dependence on the U.S. market, or protect the North American energy relationship that has made Canadian oil so valuable for decades? Drop your thoughts in the comments. If this breakdown helped you see the bigger economic picture, hit the like button, share this video with someone following energy, trade, and supply chains, subscribe to TradEconomics, and turn on notifications for more analysis on trade, infrastructure, oil, markets, and geopolitics beyond the headlines.